Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting mysteries in American frontier history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will disturb you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that consumed an entire community, where 347 souls vanished in a single night and left behind a silence so absolute that even today, researchers cannot agree on what truly happened in those dark hours. It was the year 1893. The Chicago World's Fair was dazzling millions with its white city. Electricity still a novelty that made crowds gasp in wonder. The Oklahoma land rush had recently opened territories to settlers hungry for new beginnings. In the remote regions of eastern Oregon, however, the situation was vastly different. There, carved between the Blue Mountains and the desolate high desert, existed a settlement that few maps acknowledged and even fewer travelers visited. The town was called Ashwood Crossing. Not the Ashwood you might find on contemporary maps, but a different place entirely, one that exists now only in fragmentary records and whispered family histories passed down through generations who escaped its fate. Ashwood Crossing sat in a valley so remote that mail arrived once every 3 weeks. So isolated that when winter came, the settlement might as well have been on another continent. The nearest town, Mitchell, lay 47 miles to the southwest across terrain that could swallow horses and wagons during spring floods or winter blizzards. The settlement had been founded 11 years earlier, in 1882, by a charismatic preacher named Silas Carmichael. He brought with him 73 families, 219 people total, seeking religious freedom from what they called the corruption of modern society. They were not alone in this quest. America's vast territories were dotted with such communities, experimental societies built on ideals that ranged from utopian to disturbing. But Ashwood Crossing was different. It grew impossibly fast. Within 5 years, the population had more than doubled. Within a decade, it numbered 347 permanent residents. Such growth was unusual, particularly given the settlement's isolation and the harsh conditions of high desert living where water was scarce and winters were brutal. Something drew people there, something beyond simple religious fervor or the promise of land. And on the night of October 13, 1893, beneath what witnesses 20 miles away described as a blood-red moon, caused by distant forest fires sending ash into the atmosphere, every single one of those 347 people fell silent, not fled, not scattered. Simply ceased. This is their story. The geography itself seemed designed for secrets. Ashwood Crossing lay nestled in a depression between two ridgelines of the Blue Mountains, accessible only through a narrow canyon passage that wound for 3 miles through walls of basalt rock. These walls rose 200 feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that echoed with the sound of wind and water. A creek, called Revelation Creek by the settlers, ran through this canyon and into the valley beyond, providing the precious water that made settlement possible. The valley itself stretched roughly 2 miles north to south, perhaps a mile east to west, not large, but sufficient. Juniper and sagebrush covered the slopes. Hardy grasses grew along the creek. The soil was rocky but workable. More importantly, the valley offered something invaluable: privacy. Those who lived in Mitchell, the nearest established town, remembered the Ashwood settlers as polite but distant. They came to trade twice a year, always in groups of 5 or 6 men, always bringing excellent wheat and preserved foods, always departing before sunset. They purchased supplies in bulk: tools, fabric, medicine, seeds. They asked few questions and answered fewer. They were cordial enough, wrote Sarah McKinney, who ran Mitchell's General Store, in her diary. But there was something in their eyes, not hostility exactly, more like certainty, as if they knew something the rest of us didn't, and they pitied us for our ignorance. Understanding Ashwood Crossing requires understanding the man who built it. Silas Carmichael was born in 1849 in Pennsylvania, the son of a Presbyterian minister and a mother who reportedly possessed what locals called the sight, the supposed ability to see future events. Whether this was true or simply family mythology, Silas certainly inherited his mother's intensity and his father's oratory skills. He studied theology at Princeton, but was expelled in his third year for what records vaguely describe as doctrinal irregularities and concerning interpretations of Scripture. He spent the next 15 years wandering, preaching in mining camps and frontier towns, gathering followers with a message that blended traditional Christianity with stranger elements. Those who heard him speak remembered his voice, deep, resonant, hypnotic, when Brother Silas preached. Recalled Mary Donovan, one of the few original settlers who left Ashwood before its final night. You felt like he was speaking directly to your soul. He knew your fears, your hopes, your secret shames, and he promised deliverance from all of it. His central doctrine was simple on its surface. The world was entering its final days, but there existed a path to transcendence. Those who followed this path would witness what he called the awakening, a moment when the veil between worlds would thin and the faithful would pass through to a higher existence. This belief alone wasn't unusual. Millenarian movements were common in 19th century America. What made Carmichael different was his specificity. He claimed to know the exact location where this awakening would occur, revealed to him through visions that began after he nearly died from pneumonia in 1881. That location was the valley that would become Ashwood Crossing. The initial settlers arrived in spring of 1882. They came in wagons loaded with supplies, with livestock, with determination. They built quickly and efficiently, following plans that Carmichael had apparently designed in meticulous detail. The layout of Ashwood Crossing was unusual. Most frontier settlements grew organically, buildings placed according to practical considerations. Ashwood was different, geometric, intentional. At the valley center stood the meeting house, a large wooden structure that served as church, community center, and Carmichael's residence. From this central point, the town radiated outward in concentric circles. First came the workshops and storage buildings. Then the family homes 30, 7 of them initially, eventually growing to 72. These were arranged in perfect circles, each home exactly the same distance from the meeting house. On the valley's northern edge, they constructed what they called the preparation grounds, an area of cleared land where large bonfires were built during their ceremonies. On the southern edge, they established extensive gardens and grain fields, and beneath the eastern ridge, where shadows fell earliest each evening, they carved something into the rock face. Local legends disagree about what it was. Some say symbols. Others say words in a language no one recognized. The few photographs that exist from that era are too distant and grainy to reveal details. Whatever it was, the settlers added to it constantly, chiseling deeper, expanding wider, until by 1893, the carving covered an area roughly 40 feet high and 60 feet wide. Accounts from those who visited or left Ashwood before its end describe ceremonies that grew increasingly elaborate over the years. Every new moon, the entire community gathered at the preparation grounds. They lit fires. They sang hymns that mixed traditional melodies with strange, discordant harmonies. They performed what they called the communion of stars, standing in precise formations while Carmichael led them through hours of prayer and meditation. During these ceremonies, witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky above the valley. Settlers explained these as celestial confirmations of their faith. Skeptics suggested they were simply lanterns attached to kites or balloons, designed to impress the faithful. But those who left told of more disturbing practices. Thomas Brennan, who fled with his family in June of 1893, just 4 months before the final night, later testified to federal marshals about what he called the preparations. According to Brennan, Carmichael had become convinced that the awakening was imminent. He instituted new rules. No one could leave the valley without permission. Families were separated, with men, women, and children housed in different buildings. Food was rationed, not from scarcity but as spiritual discipline. Sleep was limited to 4 hours per night. And there were the libations, every evening at sunset. Brennan told the marshals Brother Silas would prepare what he called the sacred draught. He said it opened our minds to higher truths. At first, it was only offered to adults, but in those final months, he insisted even the children drink. My wife, she tried to refuse for our daughters. That's when we knew we had to escape. The Brennans fled during a supply run to Mitchell. They told their story to local authorities, who promised to investigate, but were overwhelmed with more immediate concerns. Oregon in 1893 was still rough territory, and one strange religious community among many wasn't a priority. Besides, no crimes had been definitively reported, no bodies, no violence, just worried families and strange rumors. The authorities decided to wait until after the autumn harvest to make the long journey to Ashwood Crossing and assess the situation. They waited too long. In the weeks leading up to October 13th, travelers passing within sight of the valley reported unusual phenomena. Jacob Morrison, a cattle rancher whose land bordered the eastern edge of the Blue Mountains, wrote in a letter to his brother, "The sounds from that valley have changed. Used to be you'd hear normal town noise, hammering, animals, children playing. Now all you hear is singing, day and night, like 1,000 voices all hitting the same note, hour after hour. It sets your teeth on edge." A traveling peddler named Chester Hughes tried to enter Ashwood Crossing on October 9th to trade goods. He found the canyon entrance blocked by newly constructed gates, massive timber structures that hadn't existed during his previous visit 6 months earlier. 2 men stood guard. Hughes recognized one as Benjamin Watts, who had always been friendly in past transactions. But on this day, Watts seemed changed. His eyes were unfocused. His skin had a grayish pallor. When Hughes asked if he could enter to trade, Watts simply shook his head. "The time of commerce is ended," Watts said quietly. "The time of awakening is at hand. Return to your world, friend. What comes next is not for those unprepared." Hughes left, disturbed. He reported the encounter to authorities in Mitchell, but again, nothing was done. In frontier Oregon, religious eccentricity was common. As long as no laws were broken, communities were left to their own devices. On October 11th, 2 days before the final night, Sarah McKinney noted in her diary, "Dark clouds gather over the Blue Mountains though no rain falls. The air feels heavy, oppressive. My husband says it's just autumn weather, but I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is brewing." And then came the 13th. The day began normally throughout eastern Oregon. Ranchers tended cattle. Farmers brought in the last of their harvests. In Mitchell, the schoolteacher, Elizabeth Porter, taught her 23 students lessons in arithmetic and literature. In Ashwood Crossing, no one outside the valley knew what was happening. The settlement had been sealed for 4 days. No one had entered or left since the 10th. But that evening, people in Mitchell noticed something strange. The sunset was unusual. Deep reds and oranges that painted the sky in shades that seemed almost unnatural. This was caused by smoke from distant forest fires in the Cascade Range, a phenomenon that occasionally occurred in dry autumns. But the effect was dramatic. The sun appeared to drip blood across the western horizon, and as night fell, the moon rose swollen and crimson, filtered through the ash-filled atmosphere. A blood moon. Several Mitchell residents later reported that the sight filled them with inexplicable dread. There was something primordial about it, something that touched ancient fears buried deep in the human psyche. Sarah McKinney wrote, "I've seen red moons before. This was different. This felt like an omen." Around 9 o'clock that evening, travelers on the trail between Mitchell and the small mining camp of Dayville reported seeing an intense orange glow coming from the direction of Ashwood Crossing. This wasn't unusual. The settlement was known for its ceremonial bonfires. But witnesses said this light was brighter than anything they'd seen before, bright enough to cast shadows 20 miles away. Then, around midnight, came the sound. Multiple witnesses across a 30-mile radius reported hearing it. Descriptions varied, but certain elements remained consistent. It began as singing, hundreds of voices raised in unison, carrying across the desert night with startling clarity. The melody was unlike anything the witnesses recognized, not quite a hymn, not quite a chant, something that seemed to bypass conscious understanding and go straight to instinct. "It made my skin crawl," testified ranch hand Miguel Hernandez, who was night, watching cattle 15 miles south of the valley. "I'm not a superstitious man, but that sound, it was like hearing people sing their way into another world, triumphant and terrible at the same time." The singing continued for approximately 1 hour. Then it stopped, not gradually, not fading, just stopped mid-verse, according to those who heard it. And after that, there was no sound at all from Ashwood Crossing. The orange glow remained visible for another hour, then dimmed. By 3 o'clock in the morning, it was gone entirely. The valley was dark, silent, still. The blood moon set. The ash in the atmosphere thinned. By dawn, the sky was clear and blue and normal. But something fundamental had changed. No one immediately investigated. The silence from Ashwood could have meant many things. The end of a ceremony, the community sleeping, simple quiet. There was no reason yet to suspect catastrophe. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days later, on October 16th, when a supply wagon from Prineville failed to return from its scheduled delivery to Ashwood Crossing. The wagon belonged to Samuel Cord, a trader who had been supplying the settlement since its founding. He knew the route well. He was reliable. When he didn't return within the expected time frame, his business partner, James Fletcher, grew concerned. Fletcher organized a search party of 6 men. They departed Mitchell on the morning of October 17th, well-armed and wary. The blood moon was still fresh in everyone's memory. The strange silence from the valley had been noted. There was a feeling in the air hard to define but impossible to ignore, that something had gone very wrong. The search party reached the canyon entrance in late afternoon. What they found froze them in their tracks. The massive wooden gates that Chester Hughes had reported seeing stood wide open, not broken, not forced. Simply open, as if inviting entry. Samuel Cord's wagon sat abandoned just inside the canyon, 30 feet from the gates. The horses were still in their harnesses, alive but clearly distressed, coats dark with sweat despite the cool autumn air. The wagon's contents, flour, sugar, tools, fabric, were untouched. But Samuel Cord was nowhere to be seen. "Hello," Fletcher called into the canyon. His voice echoed off the basalt walls, repeating and fading. No response. The search party moved forward cautiously, firearms ready, hearts pounding. The 3-mile canyon passage seemed to stretch forever. Their footsteps echoed, water trickled in Revelation Creek, wind whispered through cracks in the rock. Nothing else. As they emerged from the canyon into the valley itself, the late afternoon sun illuminated a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Ashwood Crossing stood perfectly intact, every building in its place, every fence upright, gardens showing the work of recent tending, laundry hanging on lines, fluttering in the breeze, smoke rising from chimneys meaning fires had been recently lit. But not a single person visible anywhere. It was like everyone had simply evaporated, Fletcher later testified. Like the rapture had come and taken them all, leaving everything else behind, but that didn't make sense. The rapture is supposed to be a blessing. This felt wrong. This felt like something else entirely. The search party split up, checking buildings systematically. What they found deepened the mystery. In the homes, meals sat half-eaten on tables. Children's toys lay scattered on floors. Beds were made or unmade in the normal patterns of daily life. Personal belongings remained clothes, books, treasured items. Nothing valuable had been taken. No signs of struggle or violence. It was as if the inhabitants had simply stood up in the middle of their daily activities and walked away, leaving everything behind. But walked away to where, and why? The workshops were similarly abandoned mid-task. In the blacksmith's forge, tools lay scattered. In the textile building, a loom held a half-finished piece of cloth. In the schoolhouse, yes, Ashwood had built a schoolhouse. Slates showed that lessons had been interrupted. A child's handwriting, partially complete. I believe in the awakening that is to come. I believe in Brother Silas who shows us the way. I believe in... The sentence stopped mid-word. As the search party moved through the ghostly town, they noticed more peculiarities. Every door stood open. Not broken, not forced, simply open, as if the residents had opened them all simultaneously as they departed. And in every home, in every building, the occupants had left behind one specific item: their shoes. Hundreds of pairs of shoes, men's boots, women's slippers, children's worn leather shoes, all neatly placed, as if removed carefully rather than kicked off in haste. They went barefoot. Fletcher realized, all of them, 347 people walked out of here barefoot. But why? And where had they gone? At the valley's center, the meeting house stood with its double doors spread wide. The search party approached with increasing dread. The interior was a single large room with a raised platform at one end. Wooden benches faced this platform in concentric semicircles. On the walls, someone had painted murals, scenes of celestial imagery mixed with symbolic representations that none of the searchers could interpret. The platform held a wooden pulpit and a large chair, ornately carved. This, presumably, was where Silas Carmichael had preached. Behind the pulpit, a staircase descended into darkness. Fletcher lit a lantern and led the way down. The stairs went deep, 20 feet, 30 feet, eventually opening into a chamber carved from solid rock beneath the meeting house. The walls were smooth, showing evidence of years of patient work, and covering those walls, floor to ceiling, were markings. Not random scratches. These were deliberate, precise, elaborate. Geometric patterns that seemed to spiral and repeat. Symbols that resembled letters, but belonged to no alphabet the searchers recognized. And at the chamber's far end, a larger symbol, circular, complex, featuring what looked like phases of the moon arranged around a central star. "What in God's name is this?" whispered one of the search party members. "Nothing godly," Fletcher replied. "Nothing godly at all." In the chamber's center sat a large stone basin, roughly 3 feet in diameter. The interior was stained dark brown, a color that made Fletcher's stomach turn. The stains were old, layered, suggesting repeated use over years. Next to the basin sat a wooden chest. Fletcher opened it carefully. Inside were journals, dozens of them, all in the same handwriting, presumably Carmichael's. The pages were filled with cramped writing, diagrams, calculations. The searchers couldn't decipher most of it, but certain phrases stood out. When the moon bleeds, the way opens, 340, 7 souls, the required number. The vessel of flesh must be abandoned. They will understand when they stand at the threshold. Fletcher closed the journals and took the entire chest. These would need to be examined by authorities with more expertise than a group of frontier traders and ranchers. The search party emerged from the underground chamber into the fading light of early evening. The sun was setting. Shadows stretched across the valley, and suddenly none of them wanted to be there after dark. "We search the rest tomorrow," Fletcher decided. With more men, in full daylight. They made camp at the canyon entrance and spent an uneasy night, taking turns on watch, starting at every sound, seeing shapes and shadows that probably weren't there. Probably, the next morning, October 18th, an expanded search party of 20 men returned to the valley. They brought with them the local sheriff from Mitchell, a practical man named William Cartwright, who was deeply skeptical of anything that smacked of the supernatural. "There's a rational explanation," Cartwright insisted, "some kind of mass exodus. Maybe Carmichael convinced them to relocate. Maybe there was a schism. We'll find them." The expanded search began with the areas not yet examined, primarily the preparation grounds on the valley's northern edge. This was where the search turned from mysterious to horrifying. The preparation grounds covered roughly 2 acres of cleared land. At its center stood evidence of massive fires, multiple burn sites arranged in a circular pattern. The ash was recent, from the night of the 13th, based on its condition. But it was what lay beyond the fire circles that stopped the searchers cold. A trail, not a path, but a trail of disturbance in the earth, like something large had been dragged across the ground. It led from the fire circles northward, toward the ridge that formed the valley's boundary. The search party followed it, dread mounting with each step. The trail led to a section of the ridge face where the rock was different, darker, smoother, almost polished. And at the base of this rock face, they found the first physical evidence of what had happened to Ashwood Crossing's residents. Clothing, hundreds of garments, men's shirts and trousers, women's dresses, children's small clothes, all piled in a heap, folded carefully, respectfully. Atop this pile sat 340, 7 pairs of glasses for those who wore them, jewelry, pocket watches, every personal item the residents had carried, and pressed into the dark rock face itself, as if the stone had been soft enough to accept them, were hundreds of handprints. Men's hands, women's hands, children's small palms, all pressed into solid rock with enough force to leave distinct impressions several inches deep. "That's impossible," Sheriff Cartwright said, his voice shaking. "Stone doesn't. You can't." But the evidence was there. Impossible, but real. The handprints all pointed in the same direction, into the rock face, as if the people of Ashwood Crossing had pressed forward, trying to push through solid stone, or had succeeded in pushing through. One of the searchers, a miner named Patrick Sullivan, who understood rock formations, examined the wall carefully. "This stone, it's different from the surrounding basalt, darker, denser, and there's something else." He ran his hand over the surface, then jerked it back. "It's warm. The rest of the rock is cool from the night air, but this section is warm. like it's been heated from within. The search party spread out, looking for any other clues. It was a young ranch hand named Tommy Brooks who found Samuel Cord. The trader's body lay 50 yards from the mysterious rock face, partially hidden by sagebrush. He had been dead for roughly 5 days since the night he had arrived with his delivery wagon. But the condition of the body was wrong, deeply wrong. Sheriff Cartwright, who had seen his share of death on the frontier, could barely look at it. This man, he died in absolute terror. I've never seen a face frozen in such fear. Cord's eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. His hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails had cut into his palms. But there were no wounds, no marks of violence. The local doctor, who had accompanied the expanded search party, could find no medical cause of death. It's as if his heart simply stopped from fear. Dr. Harrison concluded, as if he saw something so horrifying that his body couldn't sustain the shock. Near Cord's body, they found a crumpled piece of paper, a page torn from one of Carmichael's journals. The message written on it was simple but chilling: witness, bear testament, tell the world we transcended. It was dated October 13, 1893. News of the Ashwood Crossing disappearance spread quickly through Oregon and beyond. By early November, federal marshals arrived to conduct a formal investigation. The U.S. government in 1893 was increasingly concerned about frontier religious movements after events like the Mountain Meadows Massacre and various millennial panics. An entire community vanishing was exactly the kind of incident that demanded federal attention. Marshal Theodore Aldrich led the investigation. A veteran of the Civil War and 15 years of frontier law enforcement, Aldrich had seen much that would break lesser men. But even he was disturbed by Ashwood Crossing. "I've investigated murders, massacres, and mob violence," he wrote in his official report. "This is something different. There is no violence here, no crime in the conventional sense, and yet 347 people are gone, and the circumstances suggest something far more disturbing than any crime I've encountered." Aldrich brought with him a team of investigators, including a geologist, a surveyor, a photographer, and several experienced trackers. They spent 3 weeks in the valley, documenting everything meticulously. The geologist, Dr. Marcus Chen, conducted extensive analysis of the mysterious rock face. His findings were inconclusive but troubling. "The composition of this stone is unique," he reported. "It contains trace elements I cannot identify. Its crystalline structure is unlike any natural basalt formation I've studied. And yes, it does retain heat in a manner inconsistent with surrounding rock." When asked if the handprints could be genuine, Dr. Chen hesitated before answering. "In scientific terms, no. The pressure required to deform stone in this manner would crush human bones to powder, and yet the prints are there. The depth is consistent with human hand pressure. I cannot explain it." The trackers searched for any trail leading out of the valley. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the immediate area of the rock face. No signs of passage through the canyon. No evidence that 347 people had walked anywhere at all. They didn't leave, one tracker concluded, not through any natural means. The photographer, a man named Josiah Wright, captured numerous images of the site. Many of these photographs now reside in federal archives, though few have been published. Those who have seen them report that the images carry a disturbing quality, as if the camera captured something beyond the merely physical. "When I developed the plates," Wright later wrote, "I noticed anomalies in several images, shapes that weren't visible to the naked eye, shadows that fell in impossible directions. One photograph of the rock face appears to show Something on the other side, a depth that shouldn't be there. I cannot explain it better than that. Federal investigators confiscated all of Carmichael's writings, 37 journals spanning 11 years. These were sent to Washington for analysis by experts in religious movements, psychology, and linguistics. The journals painted a picture of a man consumed by a singular vision. The early entries from 1882 to 1885 read like conventional religious writings, sermons, prayers, reflections on faith. But around 1886, the tone shifted. Carmichael began recording dreams, vivid, detailed visions of what he called the thin place, a location where the barrier between worlds grew permeable. He claimed to have discovered this place during his near-death experience from pneumonia, and that divine forces had tasked him with gathering the required number of souls to complete a great work. "I have seen beyond the veil," he wrote. "I have stood at the threshold where flesh and spirit converge. The awakening is not metaphor, it is literal truth. When the conditions align, the correct number of prepared souls, the correct alignment of celestial forces, the correct ritual observances, the thin place will open. We will pass through. We will transcend this limited existence and enter the realm of pure consciousness." The later journals became increasingly obsessed with numbers. 347 appeared repeatedly, always described as the required sum, or the completed vessel. Carmichael seemed to believe that this specific number of people, properly prepared through ritual and doctrine, could achieve collective transcendence. He calculated celestial alignments with surprising accuracy, predicting the blood moon of October 13, 1890, 3 years in advance. He described the moon's appearance as the signal fire that would mark the opening of the way, and he wrote extensively about preparation, the fasting, the prayers, the meditations, the sacred draft, that would open minds to higher perception. Chemists who later analyzed residues found in the meeting house basement identified the draft as a compound derived from local plants, including datura and other psychoactive substances. In controlled doses, these could produce powerful hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. But the final entries from September and October of 1893 were different. The handwriting became more frantic. The language shifted from calculated theology to ecstatic certainty. "They all believe now," he wrote on October 1st. "Even the doubters have felt the thinning. Even the fearful have touched the threshold in their dreams. We are ready. When the blood moon rises, we will complete the great work. We will step through the gateway we have spent 11 years opening. Our bodies are merely vessels. Our true selves will ascend." The final entry, dated October 13, was a single line: "Tonight, we leave flesh behind and become eternal." Federal authorities initially pursued the theory that Ashwood Crossing had been a mass suicide. Such events were not unknown. History held examples of groups that had chosen collective death over continued earthly existence, but the evidence didn't support this theory. No bodies were found. The extensive searches, including excavation of likely burial sites and careful examination of the burn sites at the preparation grounds, revealed no human remains. The fires had been large, yes, but not hot enough to completely destroy hundreds of bodies, and there would have been bone fragments, teeth, something. There was nothing. If this was suicide, Marshall Aldrich noted in his report, then the bodies were removed by unknown parties. But who, and why, and how, without leaving any trace? Some investigators suggested the bodies might have been dumped in a remote location, perhaps in one of the many deep ravines or caves in the surrounding mountains. Search parties explored these areas for months, finding nothing. The theory gradually lost support. Whatever had happened at Ashwood Crossing, it wasn't simple suicide. In the absence of a rational explanation, alternative theories proliferated. Some suggested mass exodus, that Carmichael had led his followers away from the valley in a carefully planned departure, destroying their identities and starting anew elsewhere. But this theory couldn't account for the abandoned possessions, the carefully folded clothing, the handprints in stone, or the complete absence of any trail. Others proposed murder by outside parties, suggesting that enemies of the community had attacked and disposed of the bodies. But there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence beyond Samuel Cord's terror-induced death. And what enemies? The settlement had been isolated, but not hated. They had no known conflicts with neighboring communities. A few investigators, though reluctant to include it in official reports, suggested something more disturbing, that Carmichael's beliefs had not been entirely delusional, that whatever he believed would happen on the night of October 13 had in fact occurred. Dr. Elinor Voss, a psychologist consulted by the federal investigation, wrote a confidential memo that was classified for 40 years. While I cannot endorse supernatural explanations as a scientist, I must note that the evidence resists conventional interpretation. The residents of Ashwood Crossing believed utterly in their impending transcendence. They had been prepared mentally and physically through years of conditioning. They consumed psychoactive substances known to produce powerful dissociative experiences. Under such conditions, is it possible that collective belief, combined with altered consciousness, could produce something, not transcendence in a literal sense, but perhaps a shared psychotic break of such magnitude that all 347 individuals wandered into the mountains and perished, their bodies scattered or consumed by predators? This remains unsatisfying, but is the most rational explanation I can propose. But even this theory struggled to explain the physical evidence, the warm stone, the impossible handprints, the complete absence of tracks. There was no criminal trial because there were no criminals to charge. But in December of 1893, a federal inquest was held in Portland to make official findings about the Ashwood Crossing incident. Survivors who had left the community before October 13 testified. Thomas Brennan described the increasing control Carmichael exercised over his followers. Mary Donovan recounted the strange rituals and the sense that something unnatural was building in the valley. He changed them, Donovan testified. The people who had been my friends, my neighbors by the end, they weren't quite human anymore. Their eyes were different. They moved differently. They spoke in unison sometimes, all saying the same words at the same moment without planning. It was like watching puppets, all controlled by the same hand. Chester Hughes described his final attempt to enter the valley. Jacob Morrison recounted the endless singing. Sarah McKinney read from her diary entries describing the oppressive atmosphere in the days before October 13. The inquest panel, composed of federal judges and territorial officials, listened to weeks of testimony. They examined the physical evidence, the journals, the photographs, samples of the mysterious stone. They heard from scientists, from religious scholars, from frontier lawmen who had investigated other unusual religious movements. In the end, they reached a conclusion that satisfied no one. The official finding, issued January 17, 1894, stated, "The residents of Ashwood Crossing, under the leadership of Silas Carmichael, engaged in collective religious practices that culminated in their disappearance on the night of October 13, 1893. The exact circumstances of this disappearance cannot be determined from available evidence. No criminal wrongdoing by external parties can be established. The case remains open pending discovery of the missing persons or definitive evidence of their fate. In other words, we don't know what happened, and we may never know. The inquest recommended that the valley be placed under federal oversight and that the settlement remain abandoned. This recommendation was followed. Ashwood Crossing was never resettled. In February of 1894, federal authorities made a controversial decision. They would destroy the most disturbing elements of the Ashwood Crossing site. The meeting house was burned to the ground, including the underground chamber with its strange markings. The fire burned for 2 days, consuming years of carefully constructed buildings and erasing the physical evidence of whatever had occurred there. The mysterious rock face was more problematic. Initial attempts to deface it, to remove or cover the handprints failed. Tools broke against the stone. Explosives had minimal effect, creating small chips but unable to significantly damage the dark rock. Eventually, workers constructed a wall in front of the rock face, hiding it from view. This wall, made of ordinary stone and cement, remained in place for decades. The rest of the settlement was left to nature. Buildings were boarded up but not destroyed. Within a year, they began to deteriorate. Within 5 years, most had collapsed. Within 20 years, little remained beyond foundations and scattered debris. The canyon entrance was not sealed, but a sign was erected warning travelers that the valley was federal property and entry was prohibited. Few heeded this warning, and even fewer returned to speak of what they found. Over the decades following the disappearance, a handful of individuals came forward claiming to be survivors of Ashwood Crossing. Their stories were investigated, and in every case, they were proven to be fabrications, people seeking attention or trying to profit from a famous mystery. But there were exceptions, strange exceptions that never garnered publicity because authorities chose to suppress them. In 1907, 14 years after the disappearance, a woman appeared in Mitchell claiming to be Rebecca Whitmore, one of the original Ashwood residents who had been 30 years old in 1893. The woman appeared to be in her 30s. She knew intimate details about Ashwood Crossing that had never been published. She could describe the interior of buildings, name residents, recall specific events. Federal investigators quietly brought in Thomas Brennan, who had known Rebecca Whitmore personally. Brennan confirmed the woman's identity with 90% certainty. "She looks like Rebecca," he said. "She knows things only Rebecca would know, but she should be 50, 4 years old now. This woman hasn't aged a day." When questioned about where she had been for 14 years, the woman gave answers that made no sense. "Time moves differently there," she said. "What seemed like hours was years in your world. I wanted to come back. I pushed through the boundary and found myself on a road 50 miles from here. I've been trying to understand what happened ever since." She was placed under medical observation. Doctors found her physically normal, but noted unusual neurological patterns. "Her brain activity is abnormal," one physician reported, "not damaged, but different, as if certain neural pathways have been entirely rewired." After 3 weeks, the woman vanished from her locked room. Guards reported nothing unusual. She simply was no longer there. No windows were opened, no doors were breached. She was gone. Similar cases occurred in 1920, 3, and 1941. Each time, someone appearing to be an Ashwood resident returned, unchanged by time, with impossible stories and unexplainable knowledge. Each time, they eventually vanished again. These cases were never publicized. The federal government, by then with other priorities, chose to classify the reports as unsolved curiosities rather than reopen the Ashwood investigation. The Ashwood Crossing case has attracted periodic attention from researchers paranormal investigators, and historians throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1973, a team of parapsychologists received permission to explore the valley. They brought sophisticated recording equipment, electromagnetic sensors, and other tools designed to detect unusual phenomena. Their findings were mixed. They reported electromagnetic anomalies near the rock face, specifically in the area where the handprints had been impressed. These readings fluctuated in patterns that seemed non-random, almost rhythmic. When they played back audio recordings from the site, some claimed to hear voices, faint, distorted, speaking words that could not be identified. Skeptics noted that these could easily be radio interference or equipment artifacts. Several team members reported psychological effects, feelings of being watched, sudden anxiety, vivid dreams after sleeping near the site. One investigator, Dr. Linda Kowalski, later wrote, "There is something residual there. Whether consciousness, energy, or simply the psychological weight of history, I cannot say. But that place is not neutral. It remembers what happened." In 1998, an archaeological team conducted a survey, hoping to find overlooked physical evidence. They discovered nothing that previous investigations had missed, but they did note that the wall constructed to hide the rock face had degraded significantly. Behind it, the dark stone appeared unchanged, still smooth, still warm to the touch, still marked with those impossible handprints. The most recent investigation occurred in 2019. A combination of historians, geologists, and forensic specialists used ground, penetrating radar, and other modern technologies to scan the valley thoroughly. They found no hidden burial sites, no chambers, no explanation for where 347 people could have gone. One finding stood out. The soil composition in the area around the rock face showed unusual properties. It contained trace elements that matched those in the rock itself, elements that have no natural explanation for their presence and cannot be replicated in laboratory conditions. It's as if reality itself is slightly different in that location, suggested Dr. Raymond Torres, the lead geologist. The laws of physics apply, but with slight variations, minute differences that add up to something significant. Today, the valley that once held Ashwood Crossing remains federal property, nominally protected as part of a Bureau of Land Management wilderness area. The designation sounds official, but is essentially an excuse to keep people out without explaining why. Access is difficult. The road that once led to the canyon entrance has long since washed away. Hikers who know the area can reach it, but few make the effort. The valley is remote, difficult to navigate, and according to those who visit, profoundly unsettling. Modern visitors report similar experiences to those documented throughout the 20th century. Feelings of unease, psychological pressure, vivid dreams. Some report hearing singing on the wind, though no source can be identified. Others claim to see figures moving in the distance, vanishing when approached. The Bureau of Land Management maintains a small weather station near the canyon entrance, supposedly to monitor desert conditions. But locals suspect it serves another purpose: surveillance of anyone attempting to enter the valley. The wall in front of the rock face has been repaired multiple times, most recently in 2015. Workers who performed these repairs reported difficulty completing the task. Tools malfunctioned. Weather turned severe without warning. Several workers reported feeling physically ill when near the rock. One worker, interviewed anonymously, said, "You can feel it, like pressure against your skull, like something on the other side of that stone, pressing back, wanting out. Or maybe wanting more to come through, I don't know, but I know I'll never go back there, not for any amount of money. The Ashwood Crossing disappearance has become woven into Eastern Oregon's cultural fabric. It's spoken of in hushed tones. Parents warn children not to wander toward the old valley. Ranchers give the area wide berth when moving cattle. A local legend has developed. On nights when the moon is red, whether from wildfires, atmospheric conditions, or other causes, people claim to hear singing coming from the direction of the valley. Hundreds of voices, all in harmony, singing a melody that resonates in the chest and makes the heart race. Some say that on such nights the barrier is thin, that someone listening carefully to that song might understand it, and understanding might feel called to follow. Several disappearances over the decades have been attributed, fairly or not, to this phenomenon. In 1949, a young couple camping in the Blue Mountains vanished without trace. In 1987, 3 hikers went missing. In 2003, a park ranger disappeared while investigating reports of unusual activity near the valley. These may all have rational explanations: accidents, animal attacks, simple misfortune in difficult terrain. But the pattern causes unease. The numbers 3 here, 2 there slowly adding up, as if something is still counting toward a required sum. At its core, the Ashwood Crossing mystery poses a question that science and reason struggle to answer. What is the nature of belief? Can conviction alone change reality? If enough people believe something with absolute certainty, does that belief somehow create truth? Silas Carmichael and 347 followers believed utterly in their transcendence. They prepared for years. They altered their consciousness. They stood at a location they were convinced was special, during celestial conditions they believed were significant. And then they vanished. Perhaps there is a rational explanation that simply hasn't been discovered. Mass hysteria leading to collective death in some hidden location, bodies never found. Elaborate hoax, though to what purpose? Secret exodus to an unknown destination, living out lives under new identities. Or perhaps, and this is what keeps the story alive, what makes it more than historical curiosity, perhaps they found what they were looking for. Perhaps in that valley, under that blood moon, the barrier between what is and what could be grew thin enough that absolute belief became a bridge. Perhaps they walked across that bridge and never looked back. The story of Ashwood Crossing remains a disturbing reminder that the human capacity for faith transcends reason, that conviction can drive people to destinations we cannot follow and perhaps cannot comprehend. 347 people, men, women, children, chose to embrace a vision that promised transcendence. Whether they found it or found only death, we may never know. The evidence suggests something beyond conventional understanding occurred in that remote valley on October 13, 1893. But evidence is not proof. Mystery is not answer. The federal government maintains its watch over the valley, not with soldiers or barriers, but with bureaucratic designation and careful silence. They do not explain why this particular wilderness area receives special attention. They do not acknowledge the anomalies, the impossible handprints, the stone that defies analysis. Some secrets, perhaps, are deemed too disturbing to share. But questions remain, haunting as the singing that people claim to hear on blood moon nights. Where did 347 people go? What happened to Samuel Cord that stopped his heart with terror? Why does the dark rock face remain warm 132 years after that final ceremony? And most disturbing, what would we find if we could see what exists on the other side of that thin place? Thomas Brennan, who escaped with his family 4 months before the disappearance, lived until 1956. In his final days, suffering from terminal illness, he gave an interview to a local historian. Near the end of that conversation, he said something that was never published. "I dream about them sometimes," he confessed. "My old neighbors, my friends, in the dreams they're not dead. They're somewhere else, somewhere vast, and they're singing, always singing, and they look back at our world through a window of dark stone. They see us, they remember us, and sometimes, God forgive me, I think they pity us, because they found what they were looking for, and we're still here, still trapped, still struggling with doubt and fear. In my darkest moments, I wonder if Silas was right all along." These were the words of a dying man, perhaps the product of medication or failing cognition. But they echo a possibility that lurks beneath the mystery, that perhaps the true horror isn't what happened to the people of Ashwood Crossing, but that it worked. To this day, on certain autumn nights when conditions align, when wildfires paint the sky red, when the moon rises swollen and crimson, when the air grows still and expectant hikers in the blue mountains report unusual experiences, they hear music with no source, they feel watched by unseen eyes, they find themselves drawn toward a valley they cannot name, pulled by something that resonates in their bones. Most resist this pull. They turn away, returning to towns and lives and the comfortable solidity of the everyday world. But some do not return. The statistics are scattered across decades, never quite enough to establish a pattern, but always present. The occasional disappearance, the missing hiker, the vanished traveler. The numbers, if you add them carefully, continue to climb, and the valley waits, patient and eternal, while the barrier between worlds thins and thickens with the changing of the moon. If this journey through one of America's most disturbing mysteries resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of belief and the boundaries of reality, then consider subscribing to The Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined not for mere entertainment, but to understand the full breadth of human experience, including those experiences that defy easy explanation. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond simple curiosity, if it made you question the certainty of your own convictions. And comment sharing your thoughts. Do you believe the people of Ashwood Crossing found transcendence, or did they find only death? Can faith alone change the fundamental nature of reality? What would you do if faced with absolute certainty about a truth the rest of the world denied? The past holds countless stories like this events that refuse to fit into comfortable categories, mysteries that challenge our understanding of what is possible. Each one offers not answers but better questions, and sometimes better questions are worth more than easy answers. Until next time, remember, the boundary between the world we know and the worlds we cannot imagine may be thinner than we believe. And on certain nights, under certain conditions, that boundary might just be thin enough to cross. Welcome to the Untold Hour, where history's darkest mysteries refuse to stay buried, and where every story reminds us that reality is stranger, more complex, and more terrifying than we dare to imagine.